Yeah, exactly. Well, no, it's not. No, it's not. But I mean,
Hello?
well, I want to speak because
Okay, so we'll kick off. If you could take your seats. There's one over here and one over there as well. Okay, great. So you're all very welcome to this evening's event, which is a hustings, which is where political candidates get to address their potential voters. And this is one particular to the European elections, which are on the 7th of June in Ireland this year. My name is Megan Carmody. I coordinate Coalition 2030. We are a network of civil society organisations and trade unions across Ireland, working together to create a fairer, more equal world where everyone's needs can be met within the limits of the environment. We advocate for joined-up policy that reaches those most in need first, or the most marginalised in our societies, as well as for policy that takes into account future generations and policy that is future-proofed, you could say. That harks back to the original definition of sustainable development, which is all the way from 1987 in a report called the Brundtland Report, which is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So I've just seen two candidates come in. You're very welcome. Please take your seats when you're ready. So Coalition 2030 was formed after a groundbreaking agreement was made in 2015 by all United Nations member states. And this was the adoption of an agreement called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This agenda, and the driving force behind it, is comprised of 17 sustainable development goals and their underlying targets. And it's now just colloquially known as Agenda 2030. These goals and their targets are all about creating the opportunity for everyone to have their needs met while staying within those planetary boundaries. It's the world's map for navigating a whole suite of complex and interconnected problems, which we can see so visibly today. The idea is that the SDGs are reached by 2030. We're already into 2024, and we're not doing very well. The world, according to the UN, is in what's known as a social recession. So we only have just over 5 years to achieve these SDGs, and those 5 years are the same 5 years that, if any of these people are elected, that they'll be in power. It's make or break time for so many issues, and we want to know today, will these elected candidates, if they are elected, contribute to humanity's breakdown or a breakthrough? This evening's event also marks the launch of our European Election Manifesto, so you all got one of those on your seats. This manifesto has 5 overarching asks, and then a number of asks that are nestled within different policy areas, given that SDGs are so broad, as well as our membership. So we have a pledge that we're asking all of these candidates to take, which is right in front of them, and also down at the back of the room, and they'll be allowed to sign it afterwards, if they do indeed pledge. So the first one, we want them, you, to pledge to lead a fast, fair, and just transition to a sustainable economy that supports decent work and operates within planetary boundaries. 2, we want them to ensure that the financial system fully enables SDG achievement by 2030. 3, we want them to work towards a fair distribution of wealth and create real social protection floors that create tangible equity and equality, leaving no one behind. 4, we want them to protect human rights and civic space and acknowledge the critical role of civil society in promoting values core to the EU. And 5, we want them to encourage their European grouping and party in Ireland to lead on the SDGs and what's known as policy coherence for sustainable development. So before I hand over to our moderator for the evening, and I'll introduce him in a moment, a little bit of housekeeping. The event is being live streamed, so John from Live Streaming Ireland is down the back working on that. Unless you're facing the camera, you won't be in the live stream, but if you ask a question later on, you will be. We'll have a photographer joining us just after 7. If you really don't want to be in any of the photos, just let us know after, and we'll make sure that none of those photos are ones that are sent out. Our setup this evening is slightly unusual, as we wanted to hear from many candidates. So we have at least 2 parties that have 2 candidates with them today, And at about 7:20, they'll do a little bit of a tag team or a substitution. And every party has been given the opportunity to do this. Importantly for the audience and the panel, the live stream will only pick up audio from the mic. And this is somewhat strategic to stop you shouting over each other, if that does come about, but you'll only be picked up if you're holding the mic. That goes for everybody in the room. The emergency exits are where you came in, and you'll be able to see them clearly outside. The bathrooms are just out here, but go out that door, and to the right, and there's an accessible bathroom there as well. And thanks again to our wonderful hosts in the Radisson, especially Ariadna, who have been really, really helpful. If you have any queries, you can go to any of the helper team, in particular the 2 people that registered you at the door, Colette and Deandra, or any of the people in Radisson attire. So I'll now introduce our moderator for the evening, Kevin O'Sullivan, who's here. So Kevin, as most of you probably know, is Environment and Science Editor and lead journalist reporting on climate change for the Irish Times. Kevin served as editor for the Irish Times from 2011 to 2017. He has a particular interest in climate solutions, in particular nature-based solutions, renewable energy, sustainability, including the SDGs, restoring biodiversity, and the risks associated with an overheating world. He has reported on the annual UN negotiations on global climate action, known as COPs, or the Conference of Parties, every year since 2017, and he is the co-author with the late Eddie O'Connor of Supergrid Super Solution, published by Orphan Press, outlining the case for creating a supergrid in Europe, and its 2nd edition is due to be published later this year. Finally, if you are tweeting, that's our handle, and use the hashtag #useyourvote. And we will get more chairs into the room in a moment. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to our moderator.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Megan. And you're all very welcome. It's great to have such a turnout, and particularly to have such a great turnout on my right, because I'm reliably informed this is the biggest assembly of Euro candidates that we've gathered so far in this campaign. So well done to you all. Appreciate your presence. We have a great audience here, and we have an audience online. So it's a big platform for you to present your position, not only as candidates, but also through the perspective of the agenda here this evening. So I think it's fair to say we face into a year of immensely significant elections across the planet, and that equally applies to Ireland in terms of the local, Euro, and general elections coming at us pretty quickly, I reckon. And it is coinciding with a period of geopolitical upheaval and uncertainty, not forgetting a worsening climate crisis, accelerating nature loss, and the after effects of an energy crisis, largely induced by the Ukraine war and likely to re-escalate if there is a wider conflict in the Middle East. Unfortunately, it's also a time where there is rising populism, polarization, and all too often toxic engagement within the social media world. Is it any wonder that discourse on addressing the really big issues of global warming, biodiversity, and persistent poverty and inequality is pushed to the side? The prioritization of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals is undermined when thrown into this cauldron, though they are in our collective interest, and especially that of the most disadvantaged citizens of the world in Africa and in the global south. But we will battle on tonight in redirecting focus on these issues, and I know that we will be greatly assisted by the calibre of the candidates present. Just to reiterate what Megan said, the questions that will be put to them are really reflective of the 4 pillars of the Coalition 2030. In other words, international, environment, anti-poverty, and trade unions. So that's just a sort of a general framework. After 8, we will open up to the floor with a Q&A, and so we would be delighted to have your statements. If you wouldn't mind identifying who you are, I think it's important, and then that will help the quality of the debate, I have no doubt. So the first duty I have tonight is to introduce the candidates, and I'm going to ask each of them to speak for 2 minutes max in terms of what their policy is, but particularly what their priorities under these key headings are. So we're going to start from my right, and Dahi is going to start first.
Okay, first of all, my name is Councillor Dahi Doolan. Delighted to be here. I'm one of two candidates standing for Sinn Féin here in Dublin, myself and my colleague Lynn Boylan. Lynn will be arriving at some stage later on, as she is with the Stardust families, and our thoughts are with them tonight. Having read it, Sinn Féin absolutely support the goals, absolutely 100%. We're delighted to be here. This is one of probably the most important discussions we will have in the run-up to the EU election. Because if we don't get this right, any of us getting elected up here, it's a waste of time. My background is community development. I'm a community development worker. I believe in a community development approach, ethos and philosophy. And to be very, very clear, community development isn't an afterthought. It's not something that's just service-driven. It is a belief in how you engage with communities to identify the changes that need to happen in communities and work with them to bring about those changes. I've been involved in community development probably more than I care to remember. Going back to '97, out in Ballymun, I was a community development worker there. I still use that philosophy and ethos in politics today. And I would hope to bring that toolkit of community development to Brussels. I've always brought it with me. Whatever my role was, either my workplace, in my daytime job, I work in a community-based drug rehabilitation centre, which we set up in '96. And I use the tools there as a city councillor, as a trade unionist, as an activist. I use that all the time. So I hope to bring that toolkit with me to Brussels. And reading through this, one thing that jumps out at me is the community-led development fund. For me, that would be, I would strengthen it and prioritise it. Because that is the core of breaking down disadvantage. And I use that word very, very clearly. We have disadvantaged communities in the city. Because some of them are advantaged politically, financially, culturally, economically. And some are disadvantaged. And they're disadvantaged because of the system we live under. And I would use this fund to try and break down that disadvantage and to ensure those communities are re-advantaged and a more balanced playing field in this city. My final point would be this: unfortunately the fund is there, but the government have chosen not to access it. And an example of that would be Bohemians Football Club. Here we go. I'm not a Bulls fan, so I'm a Pats fan, but sure, give credit where credit is due. The Bulls Football Club wanted to set up a co-op around putting a library of tools for people to use to combat climate change, and unfortunately they couldn't access the funding. But I can assure you I would love to work with you to ensure that fund is put in place and accessible for communities.
Thank you very much, Dáithí. Next is Aodhán.
Hi, my name's Aodhán O'Riordan, Aodhán like crayon. I make that joke wherever I go, and I'm sure my fellow candidates will be sick of me saying it by the time this campaign is over. Also, I'm not Eamon Ryan. So he's happened again this morning, actually. I even get his criticism. He's better look. Yeah, sorry. I'll allow you that, Grace. I'll allow you that. He is better looking. Anyway, anyway, where was I? Anyway, so yeah, my 2 minutes are up, I think, so I'll just pass on to Greek. No, look, my background, I was similar to Dáithí. I started off my professional life as a teacher in the North Inner City, and that was really what turned me to politics and made me realise about the nature of inequality, the nature of gender inequality, because I was teaching in a girls' school, a primary school, and that has really fueled my politics ever since I got elected, actually 20 years ago, and I've been in the Oireachtas since 2011. This is really about, I suppose, Dublin's place in Europe, but also Europe's place in the world. And I have to be honest, the reason why I'm running in this election is primarily because of what happened on November 23rd. And I think I've been validated by that decision, because I'm sure other candidates here would agree with me, the level of anti-immigrant sentiment, the level of racism, the level of abuse that all of us are subjected to now in this campaign, I can only speak personally, but I'm sure people will agree with me, is on another level than anything I have ever experienced in my 20 years in politics. And that is replicated across the European Union. And this election is about how we deal with that insular nationalism, and whether Europe is part of a global community for tackling international issues of inequality, sustainability, disadvantage, etc., and hunger and gender equality, or if we have a European Union which is insular, nationalist, flag-waving, and moving to the right. And that is my real concern, because I'm beginning not to recognise the political landscape here. And I say that genuinely and honestly, there's a worrying happening here in Dublin, there's a worrying thing happening in Ireland, and we're not alone, it's happening across Europe, so we have decisions to make in June.
Back to that topic later. Reid.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Breed Smith. I'm a TD with People Before Profit in the Oireachtas currently, and I was in the last Oireachtas as well. And I took up the role as spokesperson for climate and environment and learned so much. It has been really an amazing learning curve for me, and a learning curve not just in the science and the values and the intricacies of really being on the ball about climate change and the environment, but also the obstacles that one comes up against through the system that we live under. And that system is something I came up against as a very young woman. When I started working first, I was on Dublin Bus as a member bus conductors. We used to collect money and issue tickets. And I was just the first shop steward, the first woman shop steward in Dublin Bus. But we had to fight for everything. We had to fight against the inequality as women, but then all of us together had to fight for decent pay, decent pensions, decent shifts, and ultimately for better public transport. And I am passionate about public transport, and I see free, frequent public transport as a policy that we should really vigorously pursue throughout Europe. But in the fight for workers' rights and equality, I have also learned that this is a very unequal, divided world run by the Western powers in the interests of the Western countries. And all of the issues we're going to debate tonight about strategic development goals, poverty, exclusion, inequality, all stem from the economic system under which we live, and I want to challenge that in Europe at every hand's turn, and not just allow a sort of an acceptance that this is the way we live, there is no alternative, everything must base itself on profit. We have to move away from profit motivation into a motivation for society for all.
Thank you very much. Barry.
Thanks, Kevin. Good evening. Oh, yeah.
I did that. Get used to it. No, I don't know.
That one.
Oh, yes. Okay.
I mentioned this one. Sorry, yeah.
So, good evening, everybody. Barry Andrews is my name. I'm an MEP for the last 4.5 years, and I set up the Sustainable Development Goals Alliance in the European Parliament in 2020, and I'm currently the chair of the SDG Alliance. It's about 28 MEPs, and we set ourselves a number of targets, which we've achieved almost all of. Namely, the European Union carried out a voluntary review of the SDGs, which they presented at the General Assembly back in July last year. We also made an annual report on implementation of the SDGs at the European institutions, and that's happened for the last 2 years. It won't happen this year because we're in election mode, and our ambition is then to translate this into an intergroup after the election. So if either myself or Grace is also a member, get elected, we'll be able to work on that. It's very ad hoc, informal, but the SDGs are almost completely forgotten about at EU level. It's really, really hard to get any attention for what I consider to be one of the most important conceptual frameworks around sustainable development. Something there's no way we could get agreement on today, in 2024, but we have it. But we're falling really way behind on the targets that are contained and all the objectives that are contained in the SDGs. So my absolute commitment is to continue that work, to scale it up, to try to get more members, to really embed SDGs into the way we develop legislation if I'm fortunate enough to be elected.
Thank you very much. Next is Grace.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. And thanks, Barry, for saying I'm a member of the Alliance with you. So my name is Grace O'Sullivan. I'm from Tramore, County Waterford, and I suppose the framework of the SDGs are kind of the values and principles that I have basically worked on most of my life. I joined an NGO as a volunteer when I was 20, Greenpeace International. Brought me all over the world. My home was a series of ships, and you really do learn if you're living on ships going all over the world, from Antarctic through to Mediterranean, around the Irish Sea. You see how the world is connected and how important it is. that a framework like the SDGs, the Agenda 2030, how important it is, because as Megan said in her opening address, I remember the Brundtland report. I remember Our Common Future, the booklet, the blueprint for the SDGs. And I've seen over the years how we keep backsliding. And that's why, and one of the reasons I got involved in politics, and I consider myself a latecomer to politics. So I was elected in 2016 to Shannon, and then in 2019 to the European Parliament. And I mean, the SDGs, fairness, equality, our environment, the tipping points you mentioned, like, it is without a doubt that we have to strive to ensure that humanity survives on this planet. So in the European Parliament over the last 5 years, I have been the chief lead negotiator on the Environment Action Programme of the European Union to 2030. So that goes hand in hand with the whole the framework of the SDGs. I'm very committed to them, and the whole life below water, climate change. They're just such an important guiding framework. So I'm one of the alliance members in the European Parliament. I'm part of parliamentarians for the global goals across many different governments, and I will commit to work as hard as I can for the environment, for quality and fairness around the SDGs.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Next we have Sinead.
Thanks a million, Kevin, and thank you to everyone for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Sinead Gibney. I am the Dublin MEP candidate for the Social Democrats, and we're one of the parties who are going to be doing a tag team. I'm joined by my colleague and fellow candidate Rory Hearn, who'll be taking over for the second half. And this is actually a really exciting election for us as a party, because it is the first time that Ireland, every person in Ireland will be able to vote for a Social Democrat, because we're contesting in all three of the European constituencies. The Sustainable Development Goals for me are not just aspirations. They are 17 interconnected goals that offer for us a secure future, a roadmap towards a secure future as a planet. They are absolutely crucial for the European Union, not just because as political leaders and policy makers we need to protect our home and the beautiful planet that we occupy and all that live on it, but also because for the European Union, economic prosperity is dependent on us addressing climate crisis, because as a global crisis we need a global solution, and also because there are opportunities for innovation. As a party, sustainability is one of the key pillars of our platform. We believe that building a future for a better Ireland, and particularly in my case for how I'm invested in a better Dublin, for both now and into the future, we have to have a sustainable mindset going into that. And my last role, which I've just stepped down from, was as Chief Commissioner for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And in that role, I became, very familiar with the experience of those in our society who are on the fringes, who are most marginalised. And so for me, we must incorporate into any climate action that just transition which brings everybody with us. So those are the key pillars. I will absolutely commit, as I know my fellow candidates will, as MEPs, to promoting the SDGs and making sure that the European Union is the leader it can be in tackling these issues.
Thank you very much. Next we have Regina.
Hi Kevin, hi everybody, I'm Regina Doherty from Fine Gael. I'm a current senator in Shannon, former Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection, former county councillor. The reason I'm running for the European Parliament is first of all because Francis Fitzgerald decided to step down and retire, and we had a vacancy. I didn't genuinely think about it before that, but when the opportunity arose, and it's an enormous opportunity, I felt there was some unfinished business with me. I was one of the ministers on the European Council EPSCO that was the drafter and negotiator of the European Pillar of Social Rights. And there's an awful lot of unfinished business with regard to that pillar that was launched 5 years ago. And all of the ambitions in it are absolutely pure and true, but they appear to be only ambitions for most of the member states. And when we look at a lot of the economic policies that we have, or the serious regulatory files that have been passed over the last number of years. They've all got timescales. Even our European climate targets have timescales now that is linked to economic output, and that's a good thing. But these were only aspirational, and we were literally let off for member states to implement them as and when they could. And when we look at the amount of millions of people that are in poverty today that weren't in poverty 3 or 5 years ago, aspirations are not good enough anymore. So for me, the unfinished business is that we need to bring it back to the table, review it. And unfortunately, when we do review it, I don't think there's a member state that would be proud of their application of the pillar. And I think that needs to come back to the table with far more than aspirational dates, but actual targets. And that's the first thing I want to do. The second pillar I have, which is not probably relevant to this room, is Dublin businesses and regulation. And I think we're stifling innovation with over-regulation in the European Union. And I want to champion that as well.
Thank you very much. And our final panelist then is Robin.
Hi, I'm Robin Cafola. I'm a software engineer and a climate activist, and I've spent the last 6 years doing what I can to prevent climate breakdown. Despite the fact I'm up here and seeking election in Dublin, I'm not really a politician, and I'm trying to stop this election turning me into one. I co-founded my party, Rarita, because we want to address exactly the same issues that the SDGs are designed to address. The rest of the panelists have spoken about their party's pledges and promises, and what good electing will do. I won't do that. For 2 reasons. Firstly, because MEPs don't have the kind of power that they are claiming that they have. And secondly, because we're past the point where the kind of tinkering at the edges that our elected representatives can achieve can prevent climate breakdown. And we must prevent it. We have no other choice. Sadly, our ruling class have no plan that can curb emissions fast enough. They have no current incentives to devise such a plan, and we have no tools to force them. The changes that they do propose, such as the Green Party's taxation-based approach, focus entirely on changing individual behaviour. But it isn't individual behaviour that's destroying the planet, it's capitalism. If we want to prevent disaster, we need to make our society more democratic, to move power into the hands of ordinary people, and in particular, we need to extend democracy to the area where it is currently forbidden, the workplace. We need a revolution. We need to build a movement of workers and carers who will unite and strike to force systemic change, to take power out of the hands of absentee shareholders and the elected representatives who are their agents. We need to build a worker democracy, where workers own their own workplaces and have democratic control over them, where carers are paid for the work they do in the home. We need a civil service and a health service where frontline workers elect their managers and directors. We need a new social contract, where in exchange for democratic ownership, better working conditions, shorter working weeks, universal services and a universal basic income, workers agree to fully decarbonise the workplaces they now control. Only workers and carers now have the power to prevent climate breakdown, and I'm here to convince you to seize that power and to use it.
Thank you very much. And just to commend you all, you're in credit now because you kept rolling to the 2 minutes, so that's a good discipline to continue hopefully for the evening. So just to remind you, you have to have a microphone to speak because of our online audience. So I'm going to have the first question on civil society, and in specifically relating to NGOs, and I for one, in the last referendum, was taken aback by the way NGOs were perceived and criticised. So relating to that, if elected to the European Parliament, how will you safeguard the ability of NGOs and civil society to operate freely? What will you do to ensure that civil society organisations have the respect and resources required to continue their work in creating thriving democracies? So I'm going to start with the sitting MEPs. So I'm going to start with Barry and then Grace.
Thanks, Kevin. So I had a file on extractive industries, and we got an agreement on the question of having an NGO monitoring group on extractive industries as part of the Global Gateway. So the Global Gateway is the way in which the European Union is trying to mimic the Belt and Road Initiative that China has, and therefore to assert its presence in the Global South. So as well as that, as the chair of the SDG Alliance, we brought back the NGO group, which was involved in oversight of the SDGs. So they're advising us. They're sort of like a secretariat. So that's been part of the campaign for the Sustainable Development Goals. So I was the chief executive of Goal for 4 years, and I could see the work that we do on the ground, but also the strength that gives you in terms of advocacy. So I am a big supporter of NGOs and the obvious benefit to public policy from having a proper system of consultation with the third sector.
Great.
Thanks very much, Kevin. And I'm going to speak about the work that the Green Group in the European Parliament are doing in and around supporting NGOs, ENGOs, civil society organisations, because for me, having come from that background myself, I know the absolute importance of NGOs and civil society organisations in terms of advocating and influencing policy and legislation. So in the Green Group, we've been demanding a minimum standard for protection of civil society organisation in all member states across the EU, and making cross-border cooperation easier between civil society, non-profit organisations, and facilitating the legal mutual recognition of non-profit organisations among national authorities by harmonising common minimum standards on civil society organisations, guaranteeing easier access to funding for non-profit organisations at European and national level, and creating and implementing measures to support a regular, meaningful and structured dialogue with civil society organisations, and creating a statute for European cross-border associations and non-profit organisations. So I would see our role, and certainly if I go back into the European Union, as really enabling civil society organisations to cooperate and collaborate with all MEPs to try to get your policy over the line, because very often you in the civil society organisations, you're so close to the ground, you know what's going on, you're checking the pulse of society, and that's why I think it's so important that we support you.
Thank you very much, Sinead. Just there, and then we'll come to Aidan if anyone else wants to come in after that.
Thanks a million, Kevin. So despite the fact that in my last role I was head of a national human rights institution, we were constantly called an NGO, even though we weren't an NGO, but we did do a lot of work within civil society, and one of the roles we did have actually is, and IREC still does, is to contribute to the Rule of Law report, the European Union Rule of Law report, which obviously addresses civic space, and the shrinking of civic space is one of its priorities at the moment. So I'm acutely aware of the threat, and I mean, likewise, Kevin, I mean, I wasn't surprised at the abuse and misinformation that flew around during the referendum, but really saddened by it. And I think we are in a moment in time when there is a huge threat that I think has to be dealt with in a number of ways. And for me, just to pick on two specific parts that I would like to work on, firstly, misinformation. Tighter regulation on platforms, which mean that we do have to address the misinformation that is flying around at the moment and is undermining and threatening the voices of experts who are trying to constructively contribute to the very important dialogues that we have ongoing at the moment. And in the spirit of one of the things that I would love to do is, if Dubliners choose to send me to Europe, is bring back to Dublin some of the things that are done elsewhere much better, and one of those is workers' rights, because I believe that the sector in civil society here in Ireland is one of our most crucial parts of our society, and is consistently under-resourced, underfunded. People are absolutely stretched to the limit, and we need to improve the conditions under which people are working so that they can stay in those roles longer, so that organisations can keep talent and keep going and plan longer into the future and not have to be constantly fighting for funding and for their security. So those are two specifics that I would like to work on when I get there.
Thank you very much. And if you could pass the mic to Aidan. I recognise you, saw you nodding there frantically when the question was asked in terms of understanding.
Must remember not to do that again. I suppose we're in the middle of a war on truth. And with the greatest respect to you, Kevin, not everybody's reading the Irish Times anymore or watching RTE, and Andrew Tate is an awful lot more influential and powerful than anybody on this panel. And that's what we saw in the recent referendum, and the fear is that that'll only embed itself and get more poisonous as we go on. I think we have to try, in conjunction with NGOs, to make people in Ireland, as much as we possibly can, and particularly in Dublin, to fall in love with the European Union again. to reimagine why it was, or to discover again as to why it was founded, why we joined, and why it's more important now than ever. I think if the European elections were held without the local elections, the turnout could be somewhere between 15% or 20%. So what we have to do now, as Sinead has quite rightly said, we've got 9 of the 10 biggest tech companies in the world here in Dublin. We have audiovisual EU directives that haven't been transposed into national law but got fined as a result of it. So I think we have a massive job in our hands to take on those bad actors who are given platforms by people based here in Dublin, and to, again, I suppose, stand up for what is right, what is just, and to work not only with NGOs and to protect that space, but to enhance that space, and also to move beyond those bad actors in those online spaces who are now sucked into algorithms and bouncing off people with their own views, and actually reimagine the positivity of what this union is doing, can do, and will do if we, as I say, elect the right people. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to finally on this question come to the die unless someone else wants to add anything quickly.
Thanks very much. I think we need to be really, really clear here. The battle against the NGO sector and community sector is nothing new. Those of us who worked in the community sector absolutely are aware that the battle against the community sector was started many, many, many years ago. And austerity gave it a smokescreen behind which consecutive governments could hollow out our funding. Now, look at the Combat Poverty Agency, the National Anti-Racist Committee, a number of other committees that were virtually shut down, unfunded, and thrown into rubbish bin of history. And that's because of domestic policy. They shut down the Dublin Inner City Partnerships, the 4 of them. They shut down all independent community development projects, and they were our NGO and community sector. And now I believe, because of the wars, like I said, against intelligence and evidence, is now particularly pertinent in certain communities that have been disadvantaged by government policy. And I certainly would be a strong advocate for re-establishing that NGO and that community sector as a bulwark against government policy that continues to undermine and disadvantage communities and creates fertile ground for the far right and misinformation. As an MEP, I would like to use that role to access funding, access resources, and put pressure on the government to reinstate funding, reverse the cuts, and rebuild that community sector that's a bulwark against that misinformation and the far right agenda who are trying to embed themselves in our communities and sell people, sow the seeds of conflict, division, and violence in our communities. And it's not by coincidence that it happens in some of the most disadvantaged communities.
Thank you. And Breed is next, and then we're going to move on.
Aon said there that he'd like to see people fall in love with Europe again. I'm not sure if we were ever in love with Europe. What I'd like to see is fall in love with each other again. There's an awful lot of hate and division out there, and I'd like to see that happen. And NGOs have a huge role to play in it. And Dahi has outlined very clearly what austerity did to local NGOs here in this country. But the memory most ordinary working people have of Europe, the clear memory, is the Troika coming in here and imposing a bank bailout to the tune of 68 billion that was then pushed on their lives, cut their social welfare, cut their disability payments, cut the funding to the education streams, etc. And that's the memory they have. And Europe has a lot of catching up to do to erase that memory and to do positive things for the working people of this country. And I agree workers' rights are huge things, but do you know who win them? It's workers. And so every time there's a strike or an attempt by workers to get justice, we should, every single one of us, commit to be 100% behind them. And I don't see that always happening. And I could name several disputes in the last couple of years, and there haven't been many of them when workers were abandoned by the political class. If we want workers to win rights, we have to support them, encourage them, and back them, whether they're in Tesla in Sweden or in Debenhams in Dublin. And I think that's a really important point.
Well, you raised a point that we can come back to later with another question. So I'm going to move on to the next topic. This is on the whole international responsibility in terms of solidarity, humanitarianism in the context of politicization of aid in the EU, a big issue, and the resulting impact on SDGs. So my question is, if elected, would you challenge the use of the EU's international cooperation budget as an instrument to advance geopolitical and primarily foreign policy objectives? How would you ensure the multi-financial framework protects principled aid And I know that's a very technical term, but I think most of you know what that means. And I'm going to go to Regina first, and then to Robin after that, and then just signal if you want to come in.
Thanks, Kevin. I think it's one of those questions where there is only one answer. So the answer obviously is yes, and it's quite surprising that we found ourselves in a situation where we are politicising aid to the most poor and the vulnerable people in the world, and particularly those outside of the EU, that the EU's aims are, through their aid programmes, is to absolutely help. So the answer is yes, obviously, and I find it difficult to find any situation where the answer could be anything otherwise. There is the connection with foreign policy insofar as that if we have foreign countries that are manipulating that aid, not to the benefit, obviously, of the people that we're here to serve and to look after, well then obviously you have to find ways around that. But you find ways around that. You don't stop giving a country the aid just because they might have, a dictating government or whatever. So the answer is easy, yes, I will certainly do everything I can.
Yes, I would. I've lived in Africa, I've lived in Malawi, and my partner works for one of the aid agencies, so I've seen firsthand the harm that the politicisation of aid can do. I think USAID's recent funding cuts and the conditionalities that they attach is a great example of that. But also the cuts to UNRWA over Palestine is another good example. And I think as important as aid is, I think in the world of developing countries, I think fairness is as important. And part of that will be ending Ireland's role as a tax haven, removing that status, because that's one of the big drivers of inequality globally, is the ability of to use tax havens to move, to asset strip, countries by the ruling classes of those countries and push the funds into tax havens. And I think it also involves creating preferential trade deals where it's the developing countries that are preferenced is as important. And I think reparations should also be looked at from European colonial powers, that we need to push money directly particularly into African countries for development purposes.
Okay, Dahi is next, and then Sinead.
I think nobody in the room here would fail to have been moved by what's going on in Gaza. I think all of us, and myself, shed tears in front of watching what was going on in Gaza. And then to have the EU step right in there and almost give blessing to the genocide was absolutely unacceptable. And then to attempt to use aid as a tool of war was a dark day for the EU. It was a dark, dark day, particularly for Ursula von der Leyen and Hungary, who attempted to cut back on the aid. And I have to applaud Ireland for standing up. We are absolutely the outliers in the Western world in attempting to support Gaza and the Palestinians. But I think if there was ever a time to bring the question of the fundamental role of the EU around aid and the preferential treatment of Israel, that needs to end. That needs to end immediately. There's no way we can stand over that. And aid needs to be defended. The embargo, the blockade lifted. International aid needs to flow into Gaza. And the EU need to step up and support the peace process in Palestine that leads to justice, peace, and self-determination for the Palestinians. That's what the role the EU should have. And aid is a key part in bringing justice, peace, and stability to that part of the world.
Sinead.
Thanks, Kevin. And absolutely, I would also say yes, that I would challenge this. I think it allows for more scrutiny, so it is something that we have to protect, and we absolutely have to inform the giving of aid with human rights, sustainability and justice. And Ireland, as Dahi says, is rightly a leader in this space. So as representatives, we have credibility in promoting those principles. And I would also question that we have to protect the Green Deal. And at the moment, we're seeing the EPP group who are pivoting away from that towards security. So I think that's an area as well where I would like to push back against that and make sure that that Green Deal is protected within the aid.
Thank you very much. And Breed is next.
Yeah, just quickly to say, I think there is a separation between principled aid and foreign policy. And the example I'd like to give is in Gaza and other parts of Palestine, the German government builds schools and they fund hospitals. But they also give 30% of the military aid that Israel receives to Netanyahu's regime. And they haven't withdrawn that. And last Friday, they closed down a conference that many MEPs and Richard Boyd Barrett TD was to speak at in Berlin, the conference about Gaza and the genocide that's taken place. They closed it down violently and brutally, cut the electricity so that the conference couldn't stay online. So there is a problem, there's a contradiction within the EU, and Ursula von der Leyen personifies it, between the approach they have to looking after the poor southern countries, in Africa, in the middle, in eastern parts of the world, etc., and then arming to the teeth one of the most brutal regimes in the world that's carrying out the genocide in Gaza. And that contradiction is not going to be easily squared. But I tell you what, one thing we can do as a group of MEPs is to fight and insist that we don't become complicit in it, and we maintain our neutrality and are not dragged into an EU army or a PESCO arrangement, and absolutely not into NATO.
Thank you very much. Grace?
Yeah, so I really feel that we have to separate foreign policy from humanitarian cooperation without a doubt. And I think we have seen over the last number of years how Ursula von der Leyen has, as others have said, I mean, there's been a number of areas where she signed deals with Azerbaijan to import fossil fuels into Europe. We've also had the refusing to suspend the EU-Israel Association Agreement, despite clear human rights clauses, abuses. And we also see the EU continuing to supply weapons and munitions to Israel. So it's a real problem, because we are seeing a blurring of the lines, and we need to come down hard on that. And can I say, absolutely categorically, let's keep the Green Deal on the table. I agree with you, Sinead, in that regard.
Okay, Barry, quickly, and then
very briefly, I just want to say that, frankly, I think it could be that the ship has sailed on this issue. The Global Gateway is using NDICI development funds to advance Europe's geopolitical strategic objectives. That's already the case. Plus, Ireland is an absolute outlier in having untied aid. Nobody does that anymore. It's all to do with trade. It's all to do with access. And I fought against this as a parliamentarian. I could talk about it all day, but
okay, very good. Now I'm going to switch the two Sinead and Grace. So thank you very much for your participation, because we have Pauline and Rory. So because we're over halfway through. So thank you very much. So this is all part of the rotation. Sorry, I have a lapel mic, so sorry if you can't really hear me at the back. I will speak up. I didn't realise that. The panel have the roving mics. So just to introduce Pauline O'Reilly, the Green Party candidate, and Rory Hearn, who is with the Social Democrats. So just in fairness, I'm going to give you both a minute, not 2 minutes, to explain who you are and what your policies are, with particular link to what the topic is this evening in terms of the SDGs, etc.
Sure, well, look, I'm delighted to be here, and it's hard, raises a hard act to follow. I'll say that, and her experience as an MEP makes us all prouder than the Green Party. This is my first time standing for Europe in Midlands Northwest. I'm from Galway. I was a city councillor and a senator. And before that, I was a family law solicitor and an activist, very much involved in repeal, very much involved with different types of education and so on. But look, the reason that I'm standing is because I'm very, very passionate about collective action, and I see politics as part of that collective action. I think that you have to have all, from local to national to European, all working in harmony. As is the worry that I have at the moment is when we have seen the inroads into the Green Deal, we've seen the inroads into human rights. I'm also sit on the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe Parliamentary Assembly, and so I've been to both Poland and Hungary and to the US during their elections, and I think that it's a very worrying time, and I think that those of us who are serious about politics, those of us who are serious about green values and about human rights, do have to be in the room when decisions are being made to ensure that we're not rolling back on achievements. I would say they are achievements, and certainly as now a member of government, there are days when it's frustrating because you don't get everything that you want over the line. There will be days like that in Europe. But if you're not there and you're not trying, at least, to make things better, then I don't think that you're doing your full job. So that's the reason, and it's lovely to be here. And I suppose I should say as well, I'm a mother of teenagers and all of that as well. So I do other things too. I'm not just a politician.
Very good. Rory.
Thanks a million. Delighted to be here this evening, and thank you so much to the organisers for organising this event. It is so important. Just to introduce myself, I am a Associate Professor at Maynooth University and member of the Social Democrats, and delighted to be standing for the Social Democrats in Midlands Northwest, and we're the only two candidates from the Midlands Northwest here. And in terms of my background, I worked in communities in Dublin's inner city for many years in social housing. I also worked with Bernardo's, the children's rights charity, and worked with TASC as well, the think tank on inequality. Over the last 10 years, I have been researching and advocating on the issue of housing and homelessness and inequality, and also as part of my job doing research at a European level on European social policies and how we can progress a Europe of social rights. Why I'm standing and is really for a number of issues, 3 key core issues that I am standing on. The first one is Sustainable Development Goal 11, which, as you might be well aware, is to ensure by 2030 access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing. And we know that we do not have that in this country. We have seen homelessness rise dramatically, a generation locked out of being able to have a home of their own. And the European Union has a role in that, particularly in terms of what we hope to see an expansion of public investment in housing in coming years. And we need to ensure that the state aid rules at an EU level continue to support that. The second issue is the issue of climate change and sustainability. I think we need to go way beyond, we know we need to go way beyond what we're currently doing. We're missing our targets, and our entire economy is still based on continued economic growth, when, as Greta Thunberg said very clearly, it is just a fairy tale in terms of being able to make it compatible with sustainable development. The last area is child poverty. I want to make sure the EU guarantee on children is actually implemented properly. Thank you.
Great. Well, listen, thank you very much. You've touched on the next question, which relates to the climate crisis and biodiversity loss. And I think recent events have really set back the agenda somewhat, and in a very worrying kind of way, and particularly in relation to the nature restoration law. So the question I'm going to ask the panel on this is, we are coming into the final years of Agenda 2030. If elected, will you work within the European Parliament to redouble efforts to advance the EU's Green Deal, including an ambitious nature restoration law, that it is adopted, and that farmers are supported to lead on climate change mitigation and adaptation through a green and ambitious CAP? So I'm going to start with Regina, and then going to Robin at the end, and then Aidan.
Thanks, Gavin. The answer to that is yes. So just at the outset, I'd have to say, despite some of the things that have been said about Ursula von der Leyen, she has led probably the greenest commission that has been established in an awfully long time. The European People's Party, that I am a member of, but can differ in views with, has probably voted for the most Green Deal legislation in the last 5 years. And so the fact that people can say that they're concerned about rolling back on the Green Deal is in our gift. And I don't just mean the people that will be lucky enough to be elected to the European Parliament. It's anybody that's involved in public life has a responsibility to make sure that we look after the planet, the people, and hit the targets, if not sooner rather than later, that were set in the programme, the Green Deal programme. So I say that against a backdrop, though, that we do have unrest in our farming community, and not just in Ireland. We can see it across Europe, protests in Berlin, protests in Paris in the last number of months. And the reason for that is because they tell us that we're doing, our ambitions are too fast and they're not able to sustain them. And actually, I really believe 2 things that they're really telling us is, number one, we're not providing security for their income, because once they make an income, I think they will be secure and changes, and they would be far more adaptable. And number 2, they tell us we're not listening or hearing them. And those 2 things have to radically change. Otherwise, those protests are not going to end. They're probably going to get worse. And we will come under more pressure than we've seen in the last couple of years. So the Green Deal, the speed at which it gets implemented is within our gift, whether it's at a local level, or national level, or European level, and we all need to take responsibility for it.
Okay, Colin.
So just to be clear, I think actually Ursula van der Leyen and the Parliament were forced into that position by a movement of young people. You know, they wouldn't have arrived there themselves. It was people power that changed the agenda and pushed climate to the top. And in terms of the question, would I work within the Parliament? No, I wouldn't. Or at least not only within the Parliament. Because as I said, the Parliament can't solve this problem. They don't have the powers, they don't have the time, they don't have the detail, it can't be done. The only way we solve the problem is by taking power ourselves and solving the problem ourselves. We have so many small micro problems to address that a top-down solution can never solve the climate crisis. The only way it can be fixed is by each of us taking ownership of the places where we work and decarbonising those workplaces. That's the solution. You know, the taxation approach, the change behaviour approach, it doesn't work because there aren't alternatives. And the Green New Deal, the European Green Deal doesn't actually provide any new solutions. It doesn't give the tools necessary to make changes, because at the end of the day, those changes are too many, or too multitude.
Okay. Aidan is next.
I don't trust Ursula van der Leyen on a number of fronts. Israel has been mentioned. Coalescing with the far right is also an issue, and also on her attitude towards the Green Deal. I hope to be a member of the S&D group, which is the second largest group in the European Parliament at the moment, and therefore, yes, I would work within the European Union to do as much as I possibly can and to use that influence. But I think we need to change the conversation in terms of climate change and link it to inequality much more. The top 1% of earners use 12 times more carbon than the bottom 50% of earners. And if we're not getting people to buy in to what needs to be done, and it needs to be done, anybody who's interested in football in this city will know that they haven't been able to have an underage football match since January. Most weekends are off. Is that we can actually empower our communities to know what this effect, what climate breakdown is happening, that the weather patterns are changing, and there are ways to move through it. But we're not going to empower people if we don't link it to inequality, and we don't have a proper, honest conversation around that, because that's that about the level of inequality and wealth inequality when it comes to carbon tonnage was a new one to me when I learned it last week, and it stopped me in my tracks. And I think that's the kind of thing we have to couple together in having this conversation. We can make the difference. The European Union is part of that, absolutely part of that process. But I think we need to look at what Dublin's going to be like in 2050. And if things don't change, it's going to be a very, very, very different city, and it won't be something that we're going to be proud to hand on to our children. And like Pauline, I've got kids as well, one of whom was just born on Saturday. And thanks very much. Thank you. Yeah, but well, I don't know why you're applauding me, because I did very little. But the serious point is that when you do look at a child and you do think about 30 years' time, it does set your mind thinking about the responsibility that we have.
Okay, Dahi and then Reid.
Thanks very much. The Green Deal. I'm on the left. I'm a socialist, and I think, and I'll put it out there, I'll be honest in this room, I think sometimes the Green Deal and environmentalists is seen as the preserve of the affluent, the middle class, those in an already comfort zone. And I think we need to liberate it, and it needs to be part of the discussion in the workplace. The trade union movement and small farmers need to be part of that discussion, because we cannot say we're going to have a Green Deal and dislodge people from their jobs and expect them to suck it up. That's simply not going to. It's all the working class, the marginalised and the disadvantaged who pay the price for other people, and that cannot go on. So I would like to be a champion of red and green, where you absolutely have socialist economic policies, sustainable, safe communities, where there's a direct link to environmentalism. And one example of this, in Dublin, most people who are at risk of fuel poverty live in council accommodation. Those people at risk of fuel poverty live in the unregulated private rented sector. There is no point in talking to these people, with all due respect, about electric cars. And I'll put it out there, and I'll be bold and I'll be brash in it. There's no point in talking about cycle lanes to families who can't afford to pay the bills. I was, and very, very briefly, I was in 2 houses in my own area in Drimna, and there's people dying of cancer in those houses, and those houses are not retrofitted. The measly money they're on is going into electricity and gas bills. That is shocking. So we need to make our policies of any Green Deal relevant and real to these people's lives. Proper housing, proper accommodation, communities, community development, and good long-term jobs for people in the green economy, rather than just lodging them and expecting them to pay for the cost for other people. Thank you.
Reid and then Pauline.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, and this would also apply, I think, to the farming community. You see, people are sceptical for a reason. Obviously there's bad players out there, there's the role of social media, there's the nasty toxic influences that people have in their lives, but there's also reasons why they're sceptical about what goes on around them. And if you take the farming community, for example, the figure I've been given here is that around 80% of the CAP subsidies have gone to about 20% of the farmers. Now, where does that leave the other 80% of the farmers, most of whom would be small family-style farms? And of course they're going to be resentful and bitter when they watch the profits of Don Meats and Larry Goodman and Danone go through the roof. Even during the pandemic and the war, the profits of these food companies and the cost of living crisis go through the roof while the farmers struggle. So we create a certain cynicism that feeds into all the other crap that is around us. And it very much ties in with what Dahi was saying about a just transition for communities as well. It's absolutely essential. And therefore, we have to deal, and I don't know how you do this, I might have a chat with Barry or Grace or something afterwards. Do you ever try to deal with the lobbying that goes on in Europe? 30,000 lobbyists are based permanently in Brussels, lobbying on behalf of industry to influence what laws and what decisions are made. That is outrageous. Where do ordinary people get to lobby MEPs at that rate, at that intensity? And that has to be challenged. Now, how exactly you do it, I don't know, because I too am a socialist and I really admire Robin's emotions there, but you have to, Robin, be there as a voice for them as well and try and organise people as well as encourage a fight back, and that's what we'd like to see happen. And I just think there's major concerns about how the EU does its business. The fossil fuel industry dominates, the lobbyists dominate, and we're never going to get past that unless we seriously challenge them.
Quickly, Pauline and Rory, and then I just have one small question for Barry, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, just to say, I had a group of breastfeeding advocates in to Leinster House. We had a coffee morning, and I said, you know what we need to do now, when I get over to Europe, is we'll have the breastfeeding cafe, not just the other lobbyists' cafes that we all know about, we all hear about in Europe. It is important that everybody's heard and not just a particular segment. And I go back to what Robin said. I think he's correct in this, in that in 2019 we had Greta Thunberg and we had a youth movement. And because of that, we had more Greens elected than ever before right across Europe. But we also had the signal going to every other political grouping that climate mattered and biodiversity loss mattered to people. And because of that, that's why it set in train an awful lot of the legislation that started in Europe. But what we've now seen the last few months is it's gone the other direction. Why? Because they think it's off the table. And we have to, as politicians, say it's not off the table. We have to be honest. We are in a crisis. We can't just go softly on that. You start from a place of honesty and then you say, here are the solutions. But I'd say, I'm coming from the west of Ireland, a lot of small farmers, and I'm from farming stock myself, and dairy farmers included in that. And I know that when you put in place the supports for the family farm, then people do go in that direction. They absolutely 100% do. And we have had a four times increase in organic farming, and that is predominantly in my area in the west of Ireland. Why? Because farmers do love the land, but they also need to make a living. So it is about changing how Europe does its business, what money comes here, and how it's directed. And we have a part to play in that. Absolutely have a responsibility to be honest and to support people.
Yeah, the other thing in relation to this is that, and it connects directly to housing, which is where in our constituency in Midlands Northwest, the issue of, for example, students having lack of student accommodation means that there's huge levels of commuting going on People commute from as far as Donegal to Maynooth on a daily basis because they can't get accommodation. They're commuting for hours. And that also can be seen in the commuter belt around Dublin. The lack of affordable housing is pushing people out. And we're going back to that Celtic Tiger unsustainable model of living and transport, and the M50 getting blocked up again. And one of the key areas that we can address that can give a benefit is tackling the issue of vacant housing and derelict housing. And the European Investment Bank has a potential role in helping communities fund that. The other area specifically is the issue of energy, renewable energy generation, and where the benefits of that go. Because there is major concerns from people about offshore wind developments being done by private companies, that they gain the profit. And my question is, why are we not developing renewable energy to give people much, much cheaper electricity that people could benefit from, rather than just handing the profits over to big corporations?
Okay, we'll come back to that later. I'm going to ask Barry a quick question in relation to the nature restoration law. How did you react to the scenario where countries at the very last minute backtracked and said, oh, by the way, we don't support that? Like, surely that has big implications for all EU legislation if you cannot, at the ratification stage, get stuff over the line that you might have spent months or years negotiating.
Yeah, and I could give you two other examples of it. One was the due diligence supply chain legislation. We got an agreement. We did it at what's called trilogues, and then it went to the member states and it came back watered down again. So now the scope only applies to companies more than 1,000 employees, whereas it was 500 employees when we did our agreement at trilogue. Same happened on Ukraine and access to European markets. That was an agreement was made at trilogues, and then it went to the member states, Poland, Czech Republic, etc. They watered it down, and the same thing has happened with nature restoration. So it's a completely unacceptable new thing. I mean, trilogues don't have any place in the European treaties at all. So they're not mentioned anywhere. So there's a real problem here about the legitimacy and how this all happens. And as for Breed's point about lobbying, it's the farming lobby is extremely strong over there. But equally, I went for a nice dinner with the lobby group, one of the Irish trade unions. So, and anybody who will know that I will meet anybody in Brussels, particularly in the third sector, at any time.
Okay. So thank you all for that, and I'm going to move on now to the question of finance. And my question in this portion of the discussion is, how will you engage with the calls to create well-being economics across the EU? And will you commit to shifting away from the current economic model that disproportionately focuses on GDP growth? So, in other words, how will you ensure the right balance between economic goals, environmental goals, and social goals? And I'm going to ask Breed first on that, because she raised the issue in her opening address.
Well, and I'll repeat it. I think we have to move away from the profit motive being everything that drives what happens in our society. If it doesn't make a profit, it doesn't happen. And there's a real problem with this, because you see it. During the cost of living crisis, we got figures for the profits from gas companies and oil companies when people were paying nearly half their wages on their ESB bill or their gas bill. You see these profits going through the roof for all these companies. And the same with property companies, pension companies. Profits are king, profits are God when it comes to any decision that's made on an economic basis. And to be honest with you, you will never solve or even tackle the climate crisis as long as that remains, particularly because the fossil fuel industry, who are making vast profits, will not allow those profits be challenged under the current economic model. And therefore we have to say to them, if you're going to, and this has to be made legal across Europe, if you're going to make vast profits, we're going to tax them to the hilt. And we're going to take that money and distribute it to create a just transition for farmers, for workers, and for people in parts of the world that are suffering as a consequence of you burning the planet. And that would require serious political intervention. The evidence is there. Oxfam, Christian Aid, they all do wonderful research and reports to show that the inequality stems from the maximisation of profits of a handful of corporations across the globe. And as poverty rises, and the figures for European poverty is increasing all the time, but then you have to look at the corollary of that, and the corollary of that is the rich are getting richer and there's more of them. The Rich List published last week in Ireland alone showed an extra 20 millionaires out of the Rich List from last year. So I'm not saying people shouldn't get rich, don't get me wrong, I'm not jealous of people having nice holidays and things like that, but this is an obscene inequality between those who have and those who have not, and it is only getting worse. And the only thing that will rein it in is taxation on profits, so that they feel the pain when they think that they can lána bhaile, have as much as they want, and what we have to do here is to stop Ireland being a tax haven. It's cruel the way Ireland's tax haven is being used by global corporations, and that's as much contributing to this economic disaster as anything else. So our priorities are wrong, basically.
Okay.
Kevin, sorry for talking to you.
No problem. Robin is next.
Yeah, I'd agree with Brie, but I think we need to go further. I don't think that tax alone is going to solve the problem. I think that if we want to end profit and the profit motive that's ultimately destroying the planet, we need to change where that money goes to. We need to change who owns workplaces, who owns businesses, who owns property. And at the moment, it's a shareholder class that own everything, and they're the class that benefit from the destruction of the planet. It's not us, it's not the workers, it's not the carers who benefit. And that needs to change. That's fundamentally what needs to change. We need to change who owns things. In terms of the question, I would agree absolutely. I believe in economic degrowth. I think we should stop measuring GDP altogether. It's a nonsense measurement, which you can see because Ireland actually doesn't use it. We have leprechaun economics here, so we don't use GDP as our measure. So it's already, a kind of pointless measurement, and we should change the focus on well-being indicators for measuring how well we are doing as a society.
Okay, and Rory's next, and then I'm going to ask Pauline about it because I know the Greens have pushed the wellness factor. So.
Yeah, again, it is how we measure progress, and that is key. And I think that the indicators is essential because essentially our economic model of, the dominant economic model, both in terms of how we measure growth, but even economics itself, the neoclassical free market economics, is all about measuring productivity. It doesn't include things like the cost to nature, they call them externalities, as opposed to what should be integral to how we measure our progress and development. And I think we have to shift away from GDP and from productivity to look at things like mental health. We've seen the figures came out that half of our 18 to 29-year-olds in this country have low mental well-being. They're just really stark. In terms of deprivation, we have now an increase from 13% in 2021 to 17% of the population in Ireland in enforced deprivation. And the problem, the necessity to shift this requires us going to the heart of the European model, because Europe was created around the idea of the common market, and still the dominant purpose of the European Union is about economic growth. So we have to go to the heart of the European Union, change what is actually its purpose, and it should be well-being.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Pauline, just on the basis that in the programme for government, the Greens made a big push for broadening the agenda beyond GDP and incorporating wellness and how you might measure that. Was that just tokenism?
No, I mean, there has been progress, and in terms of measuring the budget, it is measured against wellness, but there's so much more to do on it. I think particularly when we look at specific actions such as transport, for instance, which I think very much, it benefits some people more than others at the moment, and we've been trying to shift that, for instance, having one new rural bus service a week and so on to bring the rural community in. But I think the challenge that we have is where we have to define things in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, and that benefit is an economic benefit. So, for instance, the Western Rail Corridor, is it worth the money? Well, it's worth the money, not based on how many people use it. It's worth the money based on and how many people use it and I guess pay to use it. It's worth the money if it brings some benefit to the local community. That's where we need to change things, and we're on that road, but it's an uphill battle. I will say it's an uphill battle, particularly around some of those large infrastructural projects. But I'd like to mention particularly Deputy Mark O'Costic has been kind of leading the way for the Greens on this issue. I wish he was here to answer the question a bit better than I have, but no, I think it's it's something that other countries do well. We have the possibility to do it in Ireland, and so hopefully we can continue that. But certainly on a European level, there's a lot of work, much more work I think than here.
Aidan and then Dahi, and then we're going to move on to another topic.
Yeah, well, I think actually a lot of the topics here are interconnected between the social Europe, workers' rights, and the question you just raised. I mean, GDP growth is meaningless if poverty is on the rise, inequality is on the rise, racism is on the rise. What the EU has actually achieved over the last 50 years, it has actually done a lot in the area of workers' rights, in terms of gender equality, in terms of anti-discrimination laws, in terms of that whole space, and that's something we have to work on. We do have one of the weakest collective bargaining rights in Ireland, in the European Union, and that has to be challenged, and that is something that we can talk about at an EU level, but it's also about campaigning for those things here. And in terms of poverty, there's so much we can learn, and Dahi will agree with me on this on addiction, there's so much we can learn from other European countries of how they approach the issue of addiction, how we can bring that expertise here to Dublin. I think you also need MEPs who are not invisible, not suggesting anybody here is, but that doesn't go missing in Brussels for 5 years and is not campaigning here in Dublin. The last point I'm making in terms of anti-poverty measures, it does come back to employment, and it comes back to employment of people with disabilities. So the EU average for employment for people with disabilities is 51%. 51% of people with disabilities in employment across the EU. The statistic here is 32%. So we're way below the European average, and that is again, a key area of poverty that is affecting people with disabilities, but also, addiction is something I've already mentioned. It is the type of Europe I think people can buy into if we're talking less about GDP and more about the collective endeavour across the European Union to lift everyone's life experience and their aspirations. That is something I think people will buy into, rather than the narrow-minded nationalism that seems to be on the rise across Europe, which is determined to break up the European Union.
Thank you very much. Quickly, Dahi.
Thanks. I'll be very, very briefly. One of the Sinn Féin have been very active and continue to oppose the trade deals such as CETA and TTIP, and there's no role for an investor court in any economic policy, and I think it's a travesty that we continue to measure wealth according to GDP. It's Dickensian, outdated, outmoulded, and should be reduced to a rubbish bin of history. How we should be measuring wealth is housing, healthcare, education, tackling addiction, the causes and the consequences of the drug crisis in Dublin. That's how we should be measuring the wealth of a nation. And we want to bring that policy thinking to creation of a social Europe, where those are the issues core to any development of any trade deal, be it our internal markets, and that's what we want to bring it in. And my final point would be how we apply this on the ground is always where I come from. How does policy affect people on the ground in their everyday life? And one tool that we have managed to use in Dublin City Council is the issue of community wealth building. It is now the policy, I'm delighted to say, of Dublin City Council to use that as a tool to break down disadvantage and bring jobs, training and dignity to communities that otherwise would have been marginalised. We want to bring that thinking to Brussels and to use that as a driving force for any economic trade or agreements in future.
Thank you very much. And now I'm going to change to the topic of poverty and inequality, which is obviously a nice shimmy from what we've been just discussing. But mindful of the huge levels of increased poverty levels in Europe and elsewhere, I just would like to ask the panel, if elected, what would you do to ensure everyone can live a life with dignity, including full delivery of the European Pillar of Social Rights? How would you build a fair and social Europe? I'm going to start with Barry on that, and then I'm going to go to Regina.
Thank you. So the European Union has, we have a vote next week on the Platform Workers Directive, which I will support, and it will have very, very progressive safeguards contained in it. In fact, Owen Reedy, one of the union leaders here, said it was one of the best things to come out of the European Union in decades. Maybe that's because everything else is rubbish, but I think he's acknowledging that it is very progressive, in fact. And the Minimum Wages Directive and what Aon made reference to, which is the gender pay gap, which has been addressed in legislation at the European Parliament, And I voted for all of these things. And I have to say that, you know, when we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 13 is about climate, and all the rest of them are there to try to make sure that we can get there and to have a just transition, have climate justice, address poverty. I mean, that's why that conceptual framework is so important. And you know, a lot of the. I just want to say something about, you know, the overall model and GDP, because I kind of missed out there. And you know, Europe has a real competitiveness problem. 99% of European businesses are SMEs, and they feel entirely over-regulated. They tell us that there is no capacity for innovation, there's no sandbox essentially for European innovation and competitiveness, and we're being outcompeted by new economies, by the Americans, and you know, we have to really look at that again and how we're going to address that issue. So I think that's a real problem for us. I think it's going to be a real priority in the next Parliament to address those issues. Sorry.
Regina.
Thanks, Kevin. So I don't mind what we actually call it, whether we call it GDP or GNI star or whatever it is, but if we don't have a thriving, growing economy, then we're never going to have the money to address any of the social ills that we're all here to talk about, and the speed at which they get addressed. So we need a thriving economy. And I think we're lucky in Ireland insofar as that we do have the money being generated by the economy, with full employment nearly in the last number of years. And it's certainly a conversation that we can have as to how we spend that money. But we do need to have the money in the first place to have the conversation about how we spend it. If in Europe, the two things or three things that we need to genuinely address, and Barry is right, the Platform Workers Directive is coming, but we started negotiating that in 2016. It's now 2024. It shouldn't take 8 or 9 years for us to discover a common platform on what's the right thing to do for platform workers, for frontier workers, for work-life balance, for minimum wages. These are all things that we should have a common aspiration for, to have a minimum standard of living, you know, treat people with dignity both in the workplace and those that don't work in the workplace. And so the only way that we can do this, to go back to what I said in the beginning, the pillar of social rights needs to have teeth. It doesn't need to be aspirational. It needs to have targets and it needs to have dates on it. Until we do that, well, then we literally are talking around ourselves in circles.
Thank you for that. Dahi.
I'll be very brief. I feel very strongly about this. I'm a trade unionist. I've been a trade union activist most of my life. I'm a member of Unite. And I think the trade unions have a key role in this. I think the Workers' Directive is to be welcomed, but the key is how is it going to be interpreted and applied by any government that's in power here. And that's the key to it. We need to make sure that there's obligations on the government to ensure that trade unions have a right to organise in the workplace, have access to their membership, have access to free recruitment in the workplace, and that it is obliged on any company to recognise and negotiate with that trade union, and that collective bargaining is central to any legislation. Because any aspiration is only aspiration and will not be applied in law. And it is key that the Workers' Directive is applied in its totality by any incoming government in this state, because otherwise it's not worth the paper it's written on. And I fear that if we continue to have right-wing or centre right-wing governments, that it will not be legislated for in its totality, or will not be brought in its totality, and that's key for workers' rights and the distribution of wealth. And my final point would be, there's no point having a thriving economy if that economy doesn't benefit everybody, their environment and their community. Thriving economy will only line the pockets of the rich and make them richer, and we will continue to have to work for the economy rather than the economy working for us.
Thank you. Aidan.
Yeah, just a few things to say, if I might. We just came from a discussion earlier as candidates in Google about AI, and I made the point that when I was teaching in Sherrill Street, the muscle memory of that community is how containerization came in the 60s, and everybody lost their jobs. And overnight, in the roll books of the school in which I taught, you could see where they used to write in the employment of the parent, generally the father, who was unemployed overnight. And then, heroin came in, and the community really suffered. So the displacement of AI, or potential for AI to displace a huge number of jobs in the next 10, 15 years, is something we're going to have to grapple with. It has advantages, but we have to be serious about it. On the minimum wage directive, as Barry has mentioned, it's actually more about collective bargaining rights than anything else. And I repeat, the reason why we have statistically 23% of Irish workers in low pay, the reason why we have 40% of young people under 30 in insecure work, is because of the relatively weak collective bargaining legislation that we have in Ireland, and we have to work on that. We have to improve that, because if the European Union has done anything, I think, for Irish workers, it has actually improved a lot, not as much as we would like, but that's certainly what my agenda would be as a member of the Labour Party, and I know Dahi will back me up on this. I don't just say that to rooms like this. I said this at the Sandyford Business District yesterday as well, that is very much part of my agenda. It doesn't have to be, it has to be a collective conversation into the future where nobody needs to be afraid of collective bargaining rights or workers' rights, because they actually benefit everybody and they also benefit business.
Okay, Reid and then Rory.
Yeah, one of Kevin's colleagues in the Irish Times asked me a few days ago to comment about the job losses in TikTok. And as it happens, the union I'm in, Unite, tried to organise the TikTok workers, but found it very, very difficult. They got talking to about 50 of them, but to get them to a meeting, get them to do something about the redundancy that they were being offered was very, very difficult. And the main reason is because they don't have rights in this country. And you just think about that, since 1913, since the lockout, we have been fighting for trade union recognition. We've never had it. And we've never had it in the state. And there's a plethora of bills sitting there in the queue. I think Labour have one, Sinn Féin have one, we have one, Independents have one, for trade union recognition to be a right in this country. Maggie Thatcher made it a right, even when she defeated the miners. She brought in legislation that said you can be recognised, will be recognised by an employer to be in a union if there's over 50% you join a union. We don't even have that. Oh yeah, you have a constitutional right to join one, big swinging. But after that your employer doesn't have to do anything about it. And this acts as a chill factor over workers' ability to organise and fight. And we have to end it. And if we don't end it, we're not going to end inequality and poverty, because that's where it starts. And the European Union, you know, they have directives on this, that and the other, but they should really impose a fine on Ireland for stopping them, for stopping the need to organise in a workplace. That would be something good they could do. The last thing I'd say is about growth. Now, Regina mentioned economic growth. Well, it depends on what you want to grow. I mean, when I drive down to outside the country a bit, you see nothing but massive data centres littered all over Dublin. The same data centres are sucking up 18 to 20% of our national grid, will suck up 30% of our national grid in the next 6 years, and they use up to 1 million litres of water a day each. And the government keeps giving them more and more planning permission, more and more tax breaks, more and more do what you like in this country. And I just am baffled by that. If you have a minister who is in the Green Party as in charge of the environment, why does he not tell them to go to hell? You cannot do this to the environment. I don't understand. No other country does it.
Well,
and so I think that's a real serious question that has to be done. What do we want to grow? We want to grow kindness, decency and care, not data centres.
We're going to open it up to the floor very soon, but I'm going to give Rory and Robin a quick opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's really important to challenge Regina's idea there and what she said about the economy, and essentially this idea that, you know, economic growth essentially will trickle down and we will get social progress. No. What you said was that the economic model, that we've economic growth, and that creates the money that then you can address issues. But that is the neoliberal idea that we've been told for 40 years will work at some point to bring social progress. It hasn't done it. All we've seen is inequality grow to its highest levels ever. The model actually doesn't work unless you put social rights central to your economic development plans and policies. Inequality grows, and we've seen that. And there's no place where we've seen poverty grow worse in this country and across Europe is the issue of homelessness. And we are now at the point where there's almost 1 million people in Europe who are homeless. And I think I want to raise the issue of tenants' rights. It's something we need to coordinate across Europe. And in this country, we're real laggards on that issue. And we saw the removal of the eviction ban earlier this year. And since that removal, we've seen 8,000 households being evicted. And I think what we need is MEPs who will actually stand up for tenants' rights and those housing issues and homelessness genuinely, rather than being sort of following this idea that at some point we'll get social progress if we keep growing the economy.
Okay, Robin, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor.
Regina's phrase, a thriving economy,
is code for wealth being funneled to the top, which increasingly is what happens in this country and on this continent. Aidan mentioned that no one should be afraid of workers. I would disagree. I think we need to make our ruling class afraid of workers.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and I have to commend you all for your brevity. And we've got through a lot of topics there. I had another question on workers' rights, but I think we kind of drifted into that and collective bargaining. So I think we've covered that topic pretty well, unless anyone wants to add anything quickly to it. But okay. So then I'm going to open it to the floor now, and please use a microphone. If you do want to take one microphone here, yeah. So just make sure you have a microphone before you ask a question. Thank you very much. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself as well. So, okay, just there beside Megan and then in the front. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, hello. My name is Karen Czesowski and I'm the coordinator of the Environmental Pillar. We are an advocacy coalition of national environmental NGOs. I have a very specific query for Dahi around Sinn Féin's position on the nature restoration law and the common agricultural policy. Sinn Féin have frustratingly voted against environmental legislation at EU level. Thank you.
On the nature restoration law and Sinn Féin's position.
Okay, to be very, very clear, if and when that is actually introduced as law, we will support it 100%. Absolutely, that's what we're going to do. We didn't support it, or we voted against it, because we felt at the time there wasn't enough funding put in place to ensure a just transition, and especially for farmers. But my heart is with you, but my head tells me we need to do more work on it. But if and when it does overcome the final obstacles in its introduction, we will not be seen wanting in its application 100%.
Next question.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, my name is Conor O'Neill. I'm the head of policy with Christian Aid Ireland. I was really glad that two of the candidates raised the issue of corporation tax, and I wanted to invite the other candidates to have their say in it as well. It's an issue that gets raised a lot at EU level, can be very controversial, and in the last year alone, two of the UN's most senior human rights watchdogs expressed concern specifically about Ireland's role in facilitating corporate tax avoidance, about how money is essentially being siphoned and funneled away from developing countries, making the implementation of the SDGs a little bit harder. And they called on the Irish government and political representatives to cooperate more at EU and UN level to address it. What are your views on that? And if you are elected, what would you do to address it in the European Parliament?
Okay, Regina.
So the only thing I can do to you is to point you to the record of our current MEPs, and so I'll take the example of Frances Fitzgerald, who on two particular reports relating to implementation of the current SDGs that we have, she tried to link the due diligence and corporate governance of businesses into the legislation to make sure that they were contractually obliged maybe to achieve them. Until we do things like that, again we go back to aspirational achievements with kind of some sort of fuzzy target in the date. We need to put it into the legislation to make sure that the governments, number one, in certain instances, but businesses, number two, adhere to the regulations that we were trying to set down. So I would support that and continue that, I think.
Okay, anyone else want to make a quick comment? Barry?
Yeah. So the Irish government has agreed with the OECD approach to the 15% corporation tax, and that's a big change for Ireland. It's it's a big fear that we will lose the investability of Ireland, upon which so many hundreds of thousands of Irish people rely for their jobs. However, we've gone along with that because we recognise there can't be a race to the bottom, exactly the issue that you're raising. So we hope that this will be a way to address that issue, so that there won't be tax avoidance, tax competition. There won't be a capacity for leveraging tax rates to try to attract investment. That's something that we have to be able to deal with. And I will say that there is a change in business's attitude. Business recognises that it has to get on top of the issues we're talking about right now. We saw CSR, then it became ESG, but now businesses are beginning to think, we can't just be about shareholder value. We have to be about stakeholder value. And there are a lot of big companies that are beginning to see that absolutely essential for competitive value. So,
okay, quick comment from Rory.
Yeah, I think Ireland needs to be much, much stronger in terms of actually promoting the common taxation rules and corporations paying their effective or the real tax and not a much smaller amount of taxation. And actually corporations are increasingly, or say, they're not here just because of the low tax rate, they're actually here because of our educated workforce. And I think increasingly they understand that there is a social contract and they have to follow a social contract, which is you pay your taxes, then we get to invest in housing for your workers, in public infrastructure, in our health system. And finally, the issue of housing is actually one where the financial flows are being used to avoid tax. And there is a role for the European Union in its capital markets to control the predatory, speculative financial flows that are trying to avoid tax, and as you say, causing those tax injustices.
Next question at the front, and then we're going to Dermot.
The question is for everyone in the panel. Think globally, act locally. In relation to community gardens and allotments, I live down the road in Crumlin. We need a provision to support allotments and community gardens all around Ireland. What are your plans to making sure that the right to grow food? We learned from the pandemic that people who didn't have back gardens, they were not able to grow food. What are you planning to do to guarantee that there's going to be a provision to have community gardens and allotments, not only in Dublin, all around the country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Dahi just to respond first, and if anyone else wants to comment, just quickly flag.
It's an excellent question. I think it's really, really good. And as somebody, I suppose, if I take off my MEP candidate hat and put on my city council hat, because that's really, really a local city council question, and it is an integral part of the city and county development plans that are currently in place. I think in the inner city it's absolutely essential that we've green spaces, that we've micro gardens and macro gardens, and we've allotments, and we need to preserve them, develop them, and ensure there's full access to them. And particularly with if we look here in Dublin, I don't know if many people are aware of the City Edge programme, which is to develop up to accommodation for 70,000 people in currently land that's zoned for businesses up by the Naas Road. It straddles into South County Dublin. It's one of the biggest projects in the Western world, definitely in Europe. We want to make sure that an integral part of that is access to green space, allotments, playgrounds, leisure, retail, and good quality homes. And that's one way we can deliver that.
I want to Aidan and then Pauline, and then I'm going to ask the next question.
I live in Marino, and 100 years ago, the state built Marino with community gardens and with civic spaces and a place where people could, meet and grow up together. And they also built the schools, and they built the shops, and they built the community infrastructure. That's when the state is fundamentally involved in building communities. Now, what we have now is that the private sector are completely involved, almost exclusively in building what they want to build for their own profit, and we don't have the community spaces or the community infrastructure or the schools or the shops, etc. That is needed, and that's why this is a European issue in terms of state aid rules, that we can actually empower our local authorities to mass build social and affordable housing, which was the answer 100 years ago to families like my own, and is also the answer now. So it may sound like a city council issue, but it's also about quality of life. And it's also about not just building housing units, but building sustainable communities where people can live, grow, and and set down roots and actually have a decent quality of life.
Pauline, and then we're going to go to Dermot.
Thanks very much. I think the other reason that it's very much a European issue is because we have a tendency to say agriculture over here and people and how they live their everyday lives is over there. Actually, this is all part of food production, and food production is small and it is large, and in Ireland it's on the smaller end, in smaller scale, and that's why we need to have reformed CAP. And you're bringing up community gardens, but I think it's all about how we can promote, I suppose, the idea that you can do things on a small scale, and it can add to our food security in this country. So thanks for bringing it up. I think it is a local authority issue, but it's also a national issue, and it's a European issue. And I think we're becoming much more conscious now as consumers about where our food comes from. And Ireland is probably only catching up. Like what we're seeing across Europe is that people want to know where the food comes from. They want it to be greener. And what we need to do is to support our people in getting to that point, because it's about competitiveness, but it's also about quality of life and wellness.
Okay, Dermot.
Dermot Torney from Dublin City University. Thanks to all the candidates for your contributions this evening. Thanks to Megan and colleagues in Coalition 2030 and to you, Kevin. The day before yesterday, we hosted our annual climate change conference in DCU, and the theme this year was climate justice across generations. Mary Robinson was our opening keynote, but the second keynote was for children and young people, two 17-year-olds, a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old who had participated in Ireland's Children and Young People's Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. And Pauline, I know you met them, and Kevin, thanks for your coverage of the conference and particularly the contributions of the two children and young people. I think it's fair to say the children and young people stole the show at the conference the day before yesterday. They got a standing ovation and Mary Robinson didn't. They spoke so powerfully and passionately, and their central message was that children and young people should have a say in decisions that affect them. And so my question to all of the candidates is, if you were elected to the European Parliament, how would you go about giving a voice to children and young people in the decisions that the European Parliament makes?
Thank you for that, Dermot. And Pauline's going to be first, then Regina, and then Aidan.
Well, just firstly to say, how remarkable the children were, and they stole the show at the Joint Rocks Committee on Climate Action as well. It was quite innovative, I suppose, the Biodiversity Citizens Assembly and how that was designed. And I know that officials from the Department of Education were sitting in, listening to the young people to hear how might they do it for a future Citizens Assembly on education, but to have children involved in the room as with the adults. And so, just to say that first. Europe feels very separate, not only to children, it feels very separate to most adults in Ireland. So there's a long, long way to go. I would certainly love to hear what their ideas are for how they want to be included, and that we make that happen. And so Dawn and Nogue, Shannon and Nogue were what kind of kicked things off here, getting people to think about how they might be involved. But I really, I suppose, as somebody who's worked with children for a long time, really resent, a tick box exercise to consultation, particularly for young people. They get enthusiastic and excited about the contributions that they've made. So it's not just about being consulted, it's also about saying, holding people accountable then. What have we done based on what you've told us to do?
Okay, Regina.
A number of weeks ago I met with the National Youth Council of Ireland, and they did a really great presentation to us one Saturday morning, and it was after a result of democracy days that they had. And the single biggest issue that they told us that day is that we don't listen to them. And even when we do show up, they think that we don't hear them. And I was really taken aback that day, because I think we do show up, and various different times in the year we do show up. And actually what struck me the most that day was one young girl said, yeah, but you leave here now, we won't hear from you till next year, or the next time you're looking for a vote. And I said, well, tell me how we communicate with you. She actually gave us great ideas that, send us videos to our Instagram that we could, they really were clued in, keyed in, and connected. And the single thing she asked me to do that week was to go and start a political conversation about how we can hear our 16-year-olds, which I did on radio. It was the week after the referendum, and I was lambasted for being a loony, listening to NGOs who want to give kids a vote, who want to give kids a voice. They do have a voice. And okay, if we gave them a vote next Tuesday, not everybody would vote, but not everybody in our age group votes. They do have a voice and they do need to be heard. And so we need to start listening properly and making sure they feel heard.
Robin, and I'm going to move quickly now and to Aidan and Dahi, because we want to get a few more questions in.
Just to be absolutely clear, we should lower the voting age to 16. I think that should be done straight away. I don't see any reason why there's a delay in doing it. I think we should introduce more democracy to schools, or some democracy to schools, and put representatives on school boards from the schools themselves. Children should have a say in their education. Nothing about us without us should extend to school children as well. We've seen how powerful they speak and how well they understand the issues at hand. I think there's no issue that's going to affect young people like climate change. There's nothing else that's going to be as central to their lives than that issue. And I think we need to give them voices now and for the rest of their lives to address those problems and be part of the solution from now, because it's them who are going to suffer the most. I suspect I might be the youngest person on this panel at the sprightly age of 36, and I'm going to be retiring into 2050 when the world could be in a really bad place of climate breakdown. It's an enormous fear for me, and I think that's the same for people my age and younger, that there may not be retirement, there may maybe not be a future past 2050. And I think giving young people power is the way to address that problem.
Thank you very much. And Aidan and Dahi, quickly.
Yeah, I'm 47 and a half, just to put that on the record. I was in Lucan today. I met the student council of a primary school, and I asked them, well, what politicians have you heard of? And the first hand went up and said Nigel Farage. But I think it's a Love Island thing, or kind of a reality TV thing. But anyway, the point I was going to make is that we do need to lower the age to 16. It was a recommendation of the Constitutional Convention, I think almost 10 years ago. They were asked if they want to lower it to 17. They all decided it should be lowered to 16. It was lowered to 16 for the Scottish independence referendum, which was a major investment of energy in the whole national discussion. You lower it to 16, you get 15-year-olds interested because they know their election is coming up, or anybody who knows that the next time the election comes up, they're going to be able to vote. And young people are just much more idealistic than, well, I don't think everybody here, but in general, I find they're more idealistic, and I would absolutely welcome that.
Okay, thank you, Dar.
I'm 21. I've had a really tough life in politics. And one of my boys is doing his junior cert, and he thinks I'm too liberal, too bourgeois, too conservative, not radical enough, not Marxist enough. But I do seriously. I think young people have a very different relationship to the EU than I did in my age group. Ours was always born of tension, criticism, and while we wanted our future is absolutely at the centre of Europe, and we want critical engagement with it. But a very practical thing we can do, if all those who remember the Lisbon Treaties, when they were defeated, there was the National Forum on the Future of Europe. I was a Sinn Féin representative on it, and it was great, cut and thrust debate. It was very worthwhile. I certainly would be a strong advocate and would establish a National Youth Forum on the future of Europe of that status over 12 months, and I would produce a report for Leinster House to see how we can actually have a proper engagement with Europe, or young people can have a proper engagement with Europe, and hold us fuddy-duddies to account.
Okay, thank you. One question here, and at the very back there, someone has been patiently waving their hand since the beginning. So, and then I'm going to ask two questions from here, so if you don't mind being quick.
Hey everyone, my name is Donald Griffin. I'm the campaign coordinator for Fair Seas, and we work primarily on marine conservation, protection and restoration. So my question is on SDG 14, life below water. How will you and your party ensure that SDG 14 targets to protect and restore ecosystems, conserve coastal and marine areas are achieved by 2030, as well as the ambitious national and EU offshore renewable energy targets are achieved by 2030? Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Pauline that as the woman who lives beside the western seaboard and all that.
Look, thanks very much, and thanks very much for your engagement. I know you have had a lot of engagement with some of my colleagues on this issue, and it's unfortunate that Grace isn't here, because I know that this is an issue that she's particularly passionate about and has worked very hard at a European level. I think it's a challenge for us because we are an island nation, I suppose, and we're still on that path to marine protected areas. And as you know, obviously we have the renewables target as well, and the two have to go hand in hand. And I do think it's probably for Ireland to lead the way on that, because we're an island nation, because we have 80 gigawatts potential off the west coast. And I suppose I meet with fishers every day who are concerned about it. I don't think there's an easy answer to it other than it is a priority. Getting the 30% marine protected areas is a priority. Having MARA fully functional and ensuring that what has to go hand in hand with getting renewables in the sea is that we're protecting nature. And I visited offshore developments off Aberdeen, and I think what you can see is that actually there's a potential role there to actually have both work hand in hand, that you can actually have biodiversity brought back to life in areas where you have renewables, because you're almost protecting the area. So look, it's ongoing work, but I think it's really important that we continue those conversations with each other.
At the very back.
Yes, thank you so much everyone. Some of you have briefly touched upon this topic of employment and workers' rights, but I'd love to hear more. Last year, 260,000 employees were laid off from 1,200 tech companies worldwide. This year, that number has already reached 75,000 and growing, and that's only from tech industries. I'm not even talking about banking, health, and other sectors. This layoff trend has also been happening across EU, including Ireland, and for many reasons: outsourcing to to lower wages countries, rise of AI and overhiring during pandemic and so forth. Of those being laid off in Ireland are immigrant workers here under working permit, mostly stamp 1, which means without employment from the company sponsoring them, they have no rights to remain in the country. Similar trends across EU. They do not have the same resources with their EU citizens ex-colleagues post-layoff, hence the inequalities. Now, if elected, what would be your plan to protect the workers' rights better against these layoff trends and its impacts both socially and economically, apart from Platform Workers Directive, in particular relevant to 2 SDGs, number 8, which is decent work and economic growth, and number 10, reduce inequalities. Thank you.
Okay, Robin.
Yeah, I'm a tech worker. I'm a programmer. I work for one of the tech companies. And yeah, it's an enormous problem. It's a huge risk that this economy is completely structured around US multinationals. And we are so exposed to a global shock in this country. I don't think we realize how quickly our economic prosperity could disappear because US tech companies can just pull out. And as we've seen the last year, are happy to do that. They're happy to lay off staff in Ireland when they, for reasons basically on how much money they make. To increase profits, they will lay off people. And I think this country is very dependent on migrant workers coming to Ireland and making an enormous contribution to the society. We don't fill enough jobs, tech worker jobs in Ireland. Our education system isn't capable of supplying those jobs. The opportunity was squandered over the last 20 years to educate Irish people to fill those jobs, and we need to bring people in, and I don't think that should change. I think they make a huge contribution. But what I do think should change is who owns those tech companies. The tech companies should be Irish owned. We have the capabilities here. We attract the talent. The weather notwithstanding. There are lots of reasons to come to Ireland and work here, and I think that the people who do should get the prosperity from those companies.
Thank you for that. And quickly, Dahi, and then I'm going to ask the first question there of all of you.
I'll be very, very brief. We've seen how Irish workers and workers in Ireland are treated. Debenhams, Clearys, the IGB workers in 2002 went into work one day and the factory was closed down and they're thrown on the scrap heap. Absolutely unacceptable. And then that happens time 100 when we talk about migrant workers. And then it allows for the racists to burrow their way in and drive a wedge between one worker and another worker, and the way against that, the bulwark against that, in my view, is trade union. Join a trade union, become involved in a trade union, but the key thing in all that, join the trade union, and I have 2 important cards in my wallet, my membership of Sinn Féin and my union card. It goes hand in hand. And the final point would be, joining a trade union is one thing, but you need legislation to underpin your rights, and that's why the Workers' Directive must be transposed into Irish legislation that's robust and binding for workers.
Okay, in deference to our online audience, I'm going to ask this question. Can you give a single answer to which European Parliament committee will be your #1 priority if elected as an MEP? As you know, that's a key platform for any MEP. So I want you to quick fire in less than 5 words, identify yourself and say what committee you want to be on. Starting here.
Councillor Daniel and Workers' Rights. Aon Reardon, Workers' Rights.
Breed Smith, I want to be on whatever committee deals with maintaining their neutrality and stopping war.
Barry Andrews, International Development Committee.
Pauline O'Reilly, I suppose I'd say Envy, but we have every Green wants to be on Envy. I think that there's a place for Green on pretty much every committee is what I'd say, because it goes right across all of the committees.
Rory Hearn, social rights in terms of ending homelessness and addressing the housing crisis.
Thank you. Regina Doherty, Fine Gael, IMCO, which is the Internal Markets and Consumer Affairs Committee.
Robin Cafola, Climate and Environment.
Very, very interesting replies, actually, but thank you very much for that. I'm going to give the last question to this man here, so if you want to take the mic there.
Yeah, I think it might be a question that a few people have, and it relates to the role that your respective political parties have in ensuring that we achieve the SDGs. Because yes, you have a role at the European level, but it won't be achieved without your parties in Ireland prioritising the SDGs. And we're in 2024, and none of your parties has prioritised the SDGs to date. None of them. The SDGs need to be the framework. It needs to be the driving framework around which you all develop your policies. That That's what needs to be done if we're going to achieve the SDGs. There's a certain amount of cynicism in my mind when I listen to you, because I don't believe that any of your parties are really committed to achieving the SDGs. So I ask you, what one thing will you do within your own parties to ensure that that changes?
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm going to ask Barry because he's there and he's involved at that level. So I think it's fairness. He should start.
Yeah, I think it's my hope is that if I'm elected, we will set up the SDG Alliance as an intergroup, which will give it money and staff, and that is really crucial. But you're absolutely right. The SDGs have completely slid down the political part. That's why we set up the Alliance. And since I set it up 4 years ago, not a line has appeared in any newspaper or on any radio station about it. There's no electoral upside to any of this. You do this. So, that's part of the reality of this situation. I think you have to be frank about that.
Reid is next, and then Dahi, and then we're going down the other end.
I would have to put my hand on heart and say, yes, I am cynical about it, and you probably interpreted that from my answers. And what I've read about it and the sort of excuses for why they've been dropped, they're multiple. They're COVID, they're the war in Ukraine, they're this, that, and the other. I actually don't accept that for 1 minute, because you take, for example, the COVID vaccine, which was, developed quickly so that people could survive the pandemic. They refused to lift the intellectual property rights on it to allow it go across the globe. That's the commitment they have to, social and equality development. It is appalling. And how do they get away with that? Because the big pharma told the governments, go to hell, we're not going to do anything about it. We need a different kind of agenda to challenge why these goals are not being met. And that does mean looking very seriously at how our economic system is organised. Because it is wrong, it is unfair, it needs to go upside down, inside out, and we have to ultimately change it to achieve those SDGs.
Okay. Right.
I think that's a great last question. I think it's a wake-up call to all of us. And I think that underpins the need for just transition, which is cross-party, cross-departmental. I don't think the green agenda, the green agreement, or environmentalism should be something separate. It should be embedded right across our politics. I am absolutely 100% committed to achieving these to the best of my ability and working with others, but it needs to be cross-sectional. It needs to cross all interdepartmental approach, not just one department, not just environment. It needs to be housing, trade, community development, employment, workers' rights, combating poverty. All those are key issues, not something separate and removed, because that's where the debate has been lost.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I would feel in defence of the Social Democrats. I think they have promoted the SDGs, and I think that in terms of what I've set out here this evening, that the key to achieving the SDGs is the real policy changes that will actually ensure they're delivered. Because what we've seen so far is lip service, commitments, but no real policy measures, no real implementation of them to actually achieve them. And I think that's what I would set out to, and I commit, if elected, to push them, and also to push it within the party as well. And the other thing is that I think that with civil society organisations, for 20 years I've been working in civil society, with civil society. I think there's a clear role for us as well to come together and build social movements. That is what changes things. Us creating the social power of people, like we saw with the students and young people around climate change. But it is, as we've seen in different times, it is when people come together across civil society, trade unions, political parties, that we mobilise people, because that is the power that can change it. So I would commit to build that as well.
Regina?
I think the question was about my party or our individual parties. So
one thing that you ask your party to do.
So the only thing I can tell you is about our track record. And so when I was in the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, the social transfer system that we have, and we can pick holes in it because it's not perfect, but it's one of the best in Europe. And the budget in the department went from 19 billion to currently 24 billion. I introduced a hot school meals programme to try and address food poverty in certain areas and certain families, but didn't want to distinguish between some children and others. So every kid is going to get a hot school meal during the daytime. We introduced employment rights legislation that Patricia King said in 2018 was employment rights legislation of a generation. So I take your point. We're not probably singing and championing it in words every single day, but I would really hope that in the actions that we've done over the last number of years, there is an attempt to try and achieve them. Now, it's never going to be good enough or fast enough, but I hope by what we've done or what I've done is proof that there's sincerity there.
I'm going to give the last comment to Robin. He's the smallest party, so he needs a little bit of extra airplay.
Thanks, the boost will help. Yeah, I dispute that because obviously Rarita is a very new party. This is our first election. This is my first time as a candidate. And I think if you looked at our programme, which is online, you'd see that it overlaps the SDGs very closely. And what we haven't had a chance yet to try to implement them. But I think I wanted to kind of touch on your point about cynicism, because I'm extremely cynical. You may have guessed about electoral politics in this country. I wouldn't be up here if I wasn't. I think that cynicism is warranted. I think we can feel just inside us that there's a disconnect between ordinary people and politicians, that they don't speak to our issues, that they don't really understand what conditions are like for people in this country, because they don't inhabit it. They are in Brussels most of the time. I think, I can't remember who it was, he said that they wanted to be in Brussels, or they didn't want to spend all their time here. And obviously the job is in Brussels. There are things you have to do there. But if I was elected, and I hope to be, I would go and do the job in Brussels, but I would spend my time here, trying to build the kind of movement that we need to solve climate breakdown and to give workers more rights. And I think fundamentally, I'm not really up here looking for votes. I'm up here looking for allies. I want to find people in your organisations who have the same vision, who want to see the SDGs implemented, and will join us and help fight for that future.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a good, strong note to end. I'd like to thank you all for your participation. Sorry I didn't get around to all the questions. We might reconvene and go through them all in due course, but I think our panel deserve a great round of applause. I think in regard to the quality of the debate and for their courtesy, which is good in the current climate, so you're to be commended for that, and I wish you well on your campaign. I know they're consuming a lot of sugar here. It's obviously going to be a long campaign. But anyway, thank you all for your participation, and safe home.